It's the afternoon of Saturday, July 24th, 1897, and a storm is raging in Boston, Massachusetts. Inside the office of Codman Codman, a young woman is opening a safe, preparing to place money from a recent client inside. Her name is Alice Barrett, and she's been working as a bookkeeper, stenographer, and glorified secretary at the real estate office of Codman Codman for a couple of years. Just barely into her 20s, she longs to one day see the world and spend time in Europe. She would often hear stories from the female clients of her boss, Mr. Codman, of their travels to places like Egypt and Venice, and she ached to be like them. But she would never see the world. An hour or so after opening the safe, she would be found dead on the floor of the office, a fire burning all around. A lightning strike, seen by many in the area, would be blamed for her demise, but a truly shocking story would be found in the ashes. The coming days and weeks would reveal a sordid story of deceit and desperation. A young woman, thought by many to be incapable of wrongdoing, would wind up becoming infamous as her friends and family discovered a web of lies she'd been hiding. What seemed at first to be a tragic tale of a life cut short would turn into something much, much bigger, though it has been more or less forgotten to time, until now. Alice Barrett was only a couple of years out of high school when she landed a job with one of the biggest real estate brokers in Boston. Her sweet disposition was enough to charm many, and William C. Codman, one of the owners of Codman Codman Real Estate, wasn't immune. Though she worked mainly as a stenographer, Miss Barrett's propensity with numbers meant she also was entrusted with handling the money and keeping the books. She loved her job, and Mr. Codman grew to rely on her more and more as time went on. Shortly after starting her new position, Alice learned a hard lesson about the risks of dealing with large sums of cash when she found herself being robbed. She was counting the money one evening when a man dressed as a day worker walked in and started asking her questions. She wasn't paying enough attention to what she was doing when the phone rang, and she wound up leaving $14 on the table as she went to take the call. When she returned, the man and the money had both disappeared, and she was in a panic as she yelled for her co-worker's help. While she wasn't injured or threatened in the robbery, she still felt the need to get a gun for protection moving forward. Though the .22 caliber handgun that she would wind up buying provided some peace of mind, it would only be a matter of time before she felt the need for something more. A little over a year after the robbery, on July 23, 1897, while out running errands for a client, she decided to make a stop at the Level Arms Company. The clerk there was preparing to close up for the day when a pretty young girl came strolling through the door. Hoping to make one more sale, he smiled and offered to help her as she made her way over to a selection of dog collars. Though she would wind up purchasing a collar, she was really there to look at the guns. She told the man behind the counter that she was looking for something a bit bigger than the .22 caliber she already had, and that it was mainly for target practice. Pulling a Smith & Wesson .32 caliber handgun out, he walked her through how to load and clean it, finally making the sale and seeing her out as she promised to return a few days later with her old gun as a trade-in. The rest of the night for Alice was more or less ordinary. The next morning, she spent some time with a friend before heading into the office to take care of some work involving the company books. The day would have likely been mostly forgettable if not for the discovery made later that afternoon by the janitor. A lightning strike had been seen in the vicinity of the office, and smoke coming from one of the windows told the old man that a fire had likely been lit by the bolt. Making his way into the building, the fire would become his secondary concern as the body of Alice Barrett laid on the floor next to the open safe. The firefighters were called and the body was moved as the flames died down. It wouldn't take long for a doctor to pronounce Miss Barrett deceased, but the question of how it happened would swirl for days. At first, they thought that the lightning strike had taken her down. Further investigation, however, would reveal a bullet hole in her chest and drive speculation. Had she been murdered? The killer using the storm to cover their tracks? A note found on her person would be the first clue. It laid out how she'd loaned money to an unnamed individual and how that person was unable or unwilling to repay the $800. The second clue turned out to be the room and the safe. Nothing seemed to be missing, and within a couple of days, the police had all but ruled out robbery or murder. The gun she had purchased only the day before had been found next to the body, and two competing theories quickly emerged. The first, mainly pushed by her family, was that Alice must have been placing the gun in the safe when it went off, accidentally sending a bullet into her heart. The thought was that she either dropped the gun or somehow squeezed the trigger when a loud clap of thunder startled her, or that the lightning strike had somehow set off the gunpowder in the round that ended her life. As plausible as that theory was, the police were leaning more and more into the idea that she had taken her own life. At first, they thought that losing the $800 she had supposedly loaned out was enough to push her over the edge. That was a lot of money to lose for someone making $8 a week, and it seemed like the best lead until they found out that the loan didn't actually exist. Though the name of the person that she had supposedly loaned the money to was withheld at first, it finally came out a few days into the investigation. John Codman, the co-owner of Codman Codman Real Estate and brother of Alice's boss William, was the name Alice had given to her mother as the person who owed the money. Mr. Codman denied the loan, though he admitted that he had taken Alice out to dinner a few times to thank her for helping him with his typewriting. He said she never charged him for the work, and the total for the dinners may have accounted for the $800 sum that she'd claimed. Pulling on that thread, the police began unraveling the life of Alice Barrett. A girl who had grown up relatively poor, Alice had begun longing for a life of adventure and means. She'd gotten a taste of the good life from her employer and those that she'd talked to over the years, and she wanted more. Having access to the books of Codman Codman and being trusted enough to never be second-guessed, she quickly discovered a way to take money from the company without being discovered. But she didn't want to outright steal. That could be messy and land her in jail. She wanted to find a way to make the money work for her so that she could get what she wanted and pay it back. Speculation is the act of investing in short-term assets on the stock market. Things that will, hopefully, provide a large return on investment in a short period of time. Part of speculation is knowing what you're investing in, but a large majority of it is luck-based. Alice Barrett saw it as a way to make enough money to live the lavish lifestyle she so dreamed of living. About a year or so prior to her death, she began taking money from her employer, using some of it to buy herself nice clothes and jewelry, and some to speculate on stocks at what were known as bucket shops. Early on, she seemed to see some success, even being up a few $100s at one point. But that luck didn't continue, and before long she had sunk somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 of Codman Codman's money into the venture. She was playing a dangerous game, and the stakes went up in mid-1897 when one of the managers, Mr. Briggs, mentioned in passing that the company was likely to be sold at some point in the not-too-distant future. William Codman was getting too old to really run it, and his brother John had been having health issues that prevented him from running it as effectively as he should have. If the business was sold, the new owners would require a thorough audit of the company's records, including the financial books, before the sale. The money Alice had been taking would show up and be obvious to anyone who looked, so she needed to come up with a plan. Further speculation wouldn't work. She'd already lost so much, and the likelihood of getting enough to cover the losses was slim. Desperate, she even tried unsuccessfully to get a loan to cover at least some of what she had taken. Feeling the walls closing in around her, she took the only option she could see. A few days prior to her death, Alice Barrett put together a will. She left whatever money remained in her accounts, as well as her earthly possessions, to various friends and family members. The will itself, or at least the timing of its creation, factored into the official theory of suicide. The whole situation started with the $800 that she had supposedly loaned out. She had received $1,000 from her father when he'd passed away in 1895, and that money sat in a savings account until she took $800 out on October 31st of that year. Most likely, she spent that money on some combination of stock speculation and extravagant goods until it ran out. Realizing that she would need a lot more than $800 to continue living the good life that she'd become accustomed to, and knowing that her salary of $8 a week wasn't going to be enough, she began to embezzle money from her employer sometime in mid-1896. She assumed that she'd be able to make the money back that she'd taken, plus a lot more, by speculating on stocks over time. Like any gambler, she most likely kept telling herself that she was due for a win at any time, and justified taking more and more money from Codman and Codman by the same logic. She might have continued the charade for a lot longer if not for the words of Mr. Briggs. The thought of being discovered, winding up in jail, and disappointing her mother probably sat heavy on her as she desperately tried to come up with enough money to hide her crimes. Being turned down for a loan seemed to be the final straw, happening the day before she died. While it seems obvious that she was planning to end her life, the question of when the decision was made to do so lingers. According to Mr. Briggs, she spent the afternoon of July 24th working, before leaving and heading home. He locked up the office a short time later, heading home at around 2 p.m. At some point after that, Alice returned to the office. Once inside, she grabbed some important company documents, including the financial records, and set them on fire in the washroom. Closing and locking the door, she then opened the safe for some reason and shot herself in the chest with the Smith & Wesson that she'd bought the day before. The letter found on her appeared to be meant to deceive the investigation into her death. She didn't name the recipient of the loan in it and even noted that her family should leave the person alone. Whether the intent was to make the whole thing look like an accident or a murder isn't fully known, but all of the evidence points to an intentional action to end her own life. The story of Alice Barrett was shocking in 1897 for a completely different reason than it would have been today. Newspapers at the time sensationalized the story, but they also claimed that what Miss Barrett did wasn't normal for a woman specifically. The reasoning seemed to be that, while women were capable of crime, they were generally more trustworthy than men. That a woman was even capable of embezzling money seemed to drive the story more than anything else. Women and men have been seen in very different lights over the course of history, and if nothing else, this story highlights as many similarities as it does differences. All she wanted was a better life, even saying in letters to friends that she wanted the ability to travel and have nice things more than anything else. She didn't want to hurt anyone, and she probably felt like the deck was stacked against her. Society expected her to marry and become a mother and a homemaker, but she wanted more. She wanted to be seen as an individual and treated with the respect that she deserved. What she did might have been wrong, but people don't always act rationally when they feel like they have no other choice. I'm going to be digging in more on this story in an upcoming episode of my podcast, The Long Way Home. I like to dive more into these Legends and Tales videos over there, reading from newspapers and even expanding on the scope of the stories that I share here through ties with other historical and even legendary events. Like these Legends and Tales videos, The Long Way Home can be found here on this channel, but it can also be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you like to listen to podcasts. The best way to catch both is to subscribe here on YouTube. I've got a lot more stories like this coming up in the next few months. If you enjoyed the video, make sure that you hit the like button down below and leave me a comment to let me know what you thought and share it. If you're interested in supporting the channel in other ways, I've got a Patreon where you can get cool things like early access to videos and even have your name show up as a producer in future episodes. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next Legends and Tales.